The president's telegram arrived at Union headquarters on a Saturday morning in July 1922. Terse, direct. The railroad shopmen would return to work under the old wage scale, or the federal government would find workers who would. Warren Harding, elected on promises of normalcy and business prosperity, had just chosen sides in the most dangerous labor conflict since the end of the Great War. 400,000 men had walked off the job 2 weeks earlier. Machinists, boilermakers, carmen, electricians, the craftsmen who kept America's locomotives running. They didn't strike the railroads, they struck the Railroad Labor Board, a federal body created just 2 years prior that had slashed their wages twice in 18 months while freight rates and executive salaries climbed. The board claimed economic necessity. The workers called it betrayal. By mid-July, trains sat cold in yards from Maine to California, their fireboxes cleaned out, their running gear silent. The strike didn't feel like revolution. No barricades went up. No speeches about overthrowing the system echoed through union halls. These were skilled tradesmen, many of them veterans of the Western Front, men who'd bought homes and raised families on railroad wages. They wanted what they'd earned, a living wage for dangerous work in roundhouses that claimed fingers and lives with depressing regularity. The companies called them radicals anyway, Bolsheviks in overalls. The newspapers, many of them dependent on railroad advertising revenue, printed the accusations without question. What made 1922 different from earlier strikes was the infrastructure itself. By the early 20s, railroads had become too essential to fail and too profitable to share. They carried 90% of intercity freight. Every factory, every grain elevator, every coal mine depended on them. When the shopmen walked out, replacement workers, strikebreakers in the language of the time, couldn't maintain the equipment at the pace required. Locomotives broke down mid-route. Brake systems failed. Accidents multiplied. On the Pennsylvania Railroad alone, derailments increased 40% in the first month of the strike. The shopmen had leverage, and the railroad executives knew it. Baltimore and Ohio, President Daniel Willard, despite his reputation as a progressive employer, told his board that every week of the strike cost the company $3 million in deferred maintenance and lost revenue. Southern Pacific tallied similar losses. The New York Central, Pennsylvania, and Union Pacific, the titans of American railroading, watched their carefully managed operations deteriorate into chaos. Equipment that should have been in service sat awaiting parts. Trains ran slower and less frequently, as inspectors flagged safety violations faster than skeleton crews could address them. Attorney General Harry Daugherty saw opportunity in the crisis. A corporate lawyer before joining Harding's cabinet, Daugherty believed unions had grown too powerful during the war years, when government control of the railroads had given workers unprecedented bargaining strength. The strike gave him the opening he'd been waiting for. On September 1st, he walked into federal court in Chicago with a petition for an injunction so broad it stunned even conservative legal scholars. He asked the court to forbid strikers from picketing, from persuading others to strike, from using union funds for strike relief, even from publicly criticizing the railroads. Judge James Wilkerson, a Harding appointee who'd been on the bench less than a year, granted everything Daugherty requested. The Wilkerson injunction didn't just ban specific actions, it criminalized solidarity. Union officials who'd been careful to keep their members peaceful now faced contempt charges for organizing strike kitchens. Men who'd walked picket lines without incident for 2 months suddenly found themselves subject to arrest for standing outside the yards where they'd worked for decades. The legal theory behind it was sweeping. Any collective action that interfered with interstate commerce could be restrained by federal courts, regardless of whether violence or property damage occurred. In practical terms, it meant the full weight of federal law enforcement would break the strike. Samuel Gompers, president of the American Federation of Labor, called it judicial despotism. Eugene Debs, 5 years from his Socialist Party presidential campaigns, said it made a mockery of the Constitution. Their words carried less weight than they once had. The Red Scare was barely 3 years past. The Palmer raids, the deportations, the anti-radical hysteria, all of it had poisoned the well for labor activism. Middle-class Americans, who might have sympathized with workers facing wage cuts, now saw any strike as potentially revolutionary. The railroads and their newspaper allies had done their work well. Violence, when it came, played into management's narrative. In Herrin, Illinois, 20 miles from the Kentucky border, strikers and strikebreakers clashed at the Southern Railway shops in late August. Shots were fired. 3 strikebreakers died in the initial melee. Then the killing turned systematic. Over the next 6 hours, Union miners from nearby coal operations joined the rail strikers in what became an execution. 21 men died total, most of them shot while trying to surrender or after being captured. The mine owners had been importing non-union labor for months. The railroad strike provided a flashpoint for accumulated rage. Herrin gave Dougherty everything he needed. Newspapers that had maintained some sympathy for the shopmen's economic complaints now ran editorials demanding federal intervention. Harding, already inclined toward the business position, authorized the use of federal troops to protect strikebreakers and railroad property. By October, the strike was effectively broken. Men drifted back to work under whatever terms the railroads offered, if they were offered jobs at all. Many weren't. The companies used the strike to purge union activists and replace them with workers who understood that organizing had consequences. The Railroad Labor Board, the entity whose wage cuts had triggered the strike, quietly dissolved itself in 1926. Congress replaced it with a new mediation system that gave workers more procedural rights, but no guarantee of economic justice. The Wilkerson injunction stood as precedent for decades, cited whenever courts needed justification for restraining labor activity. Not until the Norris-LaGuardia Act in 1932 did federal law begin to push back against the use of injunctions to break strikes. What died in 1922 wasn't just a strike. It was the belief that skilled labor could negotiate on equal terms with consolidated capital. The shopmen had been among the railroad aristocracy, well-paid craftsmen whose expertise gave them bargaining power. When they lost, every other worker in every other industry understood the lesson. Organization alone wouldn't protect you. Skill alone wouldn't save you. The federal government, despite its rhetoric about neutrality, would deploy courts and troops on behalf of employers when the stakes grew high enough. The railroads emerged from the strike stronger in every measurable way. They'd shed thousands of union workers, tightened control over their labor force, and demonstrated that federal power could break any strike if the political will existed. Freight rates, which the companies had claimed needed to remain high because of labor costs, stayed elevated. Executive compensation continued its upward trajectory. The efficiency gains from intimidated workers flowed to shareholders, not passengers or shippers. American railroading in the 20s looked triumphant. Mileage peaked. Freight tonnage reached record levels. The great passenger trains, the Century, the Broadway Limited, the Super Chief, defined luxury travel. Beneath the polished success lay a workforce that had learned to keep its head down, accept what management offered, and remember what happened when you didn't. The strike of 1922 cast a shadow that reached into the Depression, when unemployed men would accept any wage rather than risk being blacklisted. It shaped the industrial relations of a generation. The shopmen who walked out that July believed the system would treat them fairly. They'd fought in the war, built the machines that moved America, paid their dues in blood and sweat. The Railroad Labor Board had promised impartial judgment. The government had pledged neutrality. The courts would surely protect constitutional rights to organize and strike. Every promise broke against the reality of power. The railroads had money, political connections, and control over infrastructure too vital to let fail. The shopmen had their labor and their solidarity. In 1922, it wasn't enough.